tube rivet, much like a standard rivet, is a cold connection used to hold different materials together, except in this case we're going to be using tubing instead of wire. In this sample piece, I'm using both standard rivets around the outside and a tube rivet in the middle. Tube rivets can also be used, if not tightened, to allow motion within a piece, like this wheel here. You just need to make sure that you don't tighten it all the way. Now, enamelists will often use tube rivets too to connect or join elements, just because it can be a little bit more gentle on the glass than a regular standard rivet. And you can see here this enamel was tube riveted to the back plate. Now, much like a standard rivet, you could also get telescoping tubing and create spacers. So if you get one size larger than the tubing that you're flaring, it allows you to separate pieces. Okay, so we're going to join these two pieces with a tube rivet. So our first step is to select our tubing, and then I'm going to use a drill bit gauge to determine what size drill to use to drill the holes. Now, again, like a standard rivet, you want your holes to be very snug. If they're loose holes, it's just going to be a sloppy rivet. So we pick a corresponding drill bit that matches the tubing. And I'll often, if I'm going with a slightly larger piece of tubing, I'll often drill a pilot hole with a little bit smaller drill bit. So we have our two pieces. I'll often lay out on the top piece where I want my rivets to go. And then we'll center punch where we want to drill a hole. So I've center punched. Now I'm gonna go ahead and drill through both pieces. So I'm tightly holding the piece down and drilling through both parts. And then I'll open it up with a larger drill bit. And when you're drilling a larger hole, make sure you're pushing down on it or clamp it to the surface so it doesn't accidentally spin on you. Larger drill bits can sometimes catch. To remove the burr from the underside, I'm going to use a larger drill bit. You don't want to have burrs when you're connecting two parts together, because you won't get a tight rivet and it'll create a little extra space. Other than a drill bit, you could also use a bud burr, stone setting burr, or ball burr, and that'll remove a burr just as easily. The next step I'm going to do here is to flatten one side of the tubing, and I'm going to use this miter ring to do so. You can see they have V-grooves in here which you can slide the tubing into, and it will hold it perfectly 90 degrees to the surface. So I'll lift up the jaws, slide in the tubing, and then extend it on one side just a little bit. And if I push down, I can then tighten up the thumb screws, and that'll hold the tubing in there nice and snug. Then I'll put the tubing between in the V-groove of my bench pin, and that'll allow me to file right up against the tool to create a perfectly 90-degree angle. And I don't use a really nice file for this. I'll use a sort of a cheap single cut mill file, just because the tool is hardened steel and can be rough on files. Then I'll remove the burr that I just got from filing it flat, and I can do that with either some sandpaper, a fine file, and I'll remove it from the outside, and then I'll use a little burr to remove the burr on the inside. And that'll just get the end of the tube relatively smooth. Okay, we'll next cut the tubing to the proper length. So I'll measure the stack that I want to rivet together, and then I'll add 2 millimeters. That allows me to have 1 millimeter on each side. Now, to mark the tubing's length, you'll notice I tightened up the end of the calipers, and I'm resting one side of the caliper on the top of the tubing and just spinning it with my thumb, and then using the other side to scratch a line. And now I can cut a little to the left of that line, and then I'll just put it right back into my mitering jig and flatten it. Now if you're cutting a lot of rivets that are going to be the same length, a lot of people will like to use with a tube cutting jig, and this here is a tube cutting jig, and this allows you to figure out what length you want, and then it has a little thumb screw here, and you can set this guide at whatever length you want the rivet to be. Once you set that, you can then tighten it, and then when you push your tubing up against it, will hit that little wall and allow you to cut multiple pieces the same size. Just make sure when you're cutting, you're scooting your saw blade up against one side of the wall at a consistent rate, or they'll be slightly off. And you can see here, now I'm next putting it back into that mitering jig and filing it up to the line. And again, this is my favorite way of flattening a piece of tubing, but there are other ways to flatten pieces of tubing if you don't have a mitering jig. One such technique is to chuck up a smaller piece of tubing into your flex shaft. So you can see here, I just put it in there and I'm going to tighten that up. And then you could use your flex shaft kind of like a lathe, and while it's spinning you could file it nice and flat. And that'll get your end looking pretty much a 90 degree. Another technique is to chuck it up in a small drill press. And you can see here I'm taking the tubing, again closing the jaws around it and snugging it up with the chuck key. And then what I've done is I've taped some sandpaper down to either a piece of glass or a surface block. And as the drill press is spinning, you can lower the arbor of the drill press, and the sandpaper will flatten the end of the tubing. Just use light pressure because you don't want to put a hole through the sandpaper. Okay, and you can see here we've got about 1 millimeter on both sides, and that's what we want. We do want to anneal the tubing. That way when we flare it, we're not going to accidentally split it. So we'll anneal it, quench it in water, and then pickle it. Now when I first learned how to make tube rivets, I learned using dapping tools, starting with a smaller dapping tool and then tapping the tubing back and forth, which would flare it, and then increasing the size of the dapping tool as you go along. And I taught it like that for a long period of time. But often what would happen was the student would pick the wrong size dapping tools and the rivets wouldn't end up looking very clean. So I came up with a set of flaring tools that sort of eliminated any guessing of what size you should use. Now to use these tools, we're going to start with the sharpest tool, and we'll have our stack together with our tubing, and we're just going to twirl it by hand just to start to flare the end of the tool. And we'll twirl one side, we'll flip it, and then twirl the other. We're not going to tap it with a chasing hammer because it's so sharp it could put a little dent in our surface block. Notice how I am doing this on a surface plate. Next we'll grab our second sharpest tool, and now we're going to start gently tapping it with a chasing hammer. And we'll tap one side, and we'll flip it, and we'll tap the other. And as we're doing this, we're trying to keep that tubing centered between the two plates. That way when they fold around, they look symmetrical on both sides. And we're going to work our way down through the different angles. You'll notice how they sort of increasingly get flatter, and that will flare the tubing at a really gentle rate. And you saw me there sort of adjusting to make sure I'm centered. Light tap, flip it, and we'll tap that again. And the last tool is almost flat. It has a very slight angle, and that'll pretty much make that rivet nice and flush up against the material. And you can see here it's sort of just closing up any other gaps. Now if you do have any gaps left, you can always finish it off a little bit with a riveting hammer. Alright, so you could just very gently go around the edge of that tube rivet and make sure it's really flush up against the material. And that's about it.